My Mark II ST is in very desperate need of some new brakes. So in this video we're going to do a complete overhaul. One of the rears is sticking, the fronts are also squeaking a little bit. We're going to do a full brake caliper rebuild, refurbishment, new discs, pads, braided lines and new fluid. With the car in the air and the wheels off, let's get started. Starting on the rears, the spacer needs to come off first, then the slider pin caps can come off and the slider pins can be loosened with a 7mm Allen key and pulled out. I used a pair of mole grips to pull the handbrake cable out of the hook. Then you can remove it from the caliper. Next up is the caliper spring, which pops out using a flathead screwdriver. After that, the caliper can be removed from the carrier, exposing the brake pads. And as I'm fitting braided lines, I remove the stock rubber line from the hard line, pulled the retaining clip out, remove the rubber grommet from the bracket, and the caliper can be removed completely. The pads can be removed from the carrier, and once the carrier bolts on the back are removed, the carrier can be taken off the hub. Leave something for my son and my daughter in case of my departure. Finally, the disc can come off with a few taps of the hammer, and that's the rears done. Moving on to the front, and it's pretty much the same, just with less steps. With the slider pin caps off, using the same 7mm Allen key, the slider pins can be loosened. Then the caliper spring can be removed, again just using a flathead screwdriver. I'll remove the slider pins with some pliers. Then the caliper is free to come off with the brake pads still inside. All the bridges burned along the way and how we still run and still swim even though we underwater. Next up is the stock hose. Same process as the rear, except the retaining pin is a little harder to get to. Feel there's more for me to do until I call it quits. Everything I do is for the ones I love and miss. Once that's removed, just need to pull it off the bracket and the caliper's free. The carrier can then be removed, again just the 2 bolts on the back. Now you got buyer's remorse. I stay composed when them bloodsuckers hit me with a tireless swarm. I've been down but never finished. And last but not least, the disc. Just a few taps and it's free. I quickly got the other side off and now it's time for the refurb. So with all the brakes out, then we can start removing the stock brake line hoses, give them a clean up, sand them down ready for the new spray paint, and then once they're sprayed we can get going with the rebuild. Those stock hoses were extremely tight, so some WD-40 was definitely needed. Even after a few whacks with a hammer, they still didn't budge, so I used a vise which worked a treat. Luckily the fronts were much easier to get off as you can lie them flat. Then the bleed nipple can be removed, the pads can be taken out, and then the slider pin seals can be pushed out. I soaked them in some WD-40 and used a flathead screwdriver to poke them out. Last thing to remove is the piston and seals. As I won't be reusing this piston, I wasn't worried about damaging it, so a screwdriver and a hammer made light work of it. With the piston out, the seals can be removed. There's one on the outside of the caliper and one inside where the piston goes. With the fronts done, the rears can now be stripped. As the rear has the handbrake mechanism, it is a little bit different to get them apart. Again, starting with the bleed nipple, then the handbrake spring can be popped off. The slider pin seals can be pushed out, then it's time to get the piston out. This is where the rears are different to the fronts. The piston has to be wound out as it moves on a thread. This isn't the correct way to do it, but as my rewind tool didn't fit the holes on the piston, I just used a pair of mole grips, and again, I won't be reusing this piston, so I wasn't worried about damaging it. Then finally, the 2 seals can be removed. Now the prep for paint can start, so I gave them a good clean with some strong degreaser and a wire brush. Blasted away all the grime with some brake cleaner and then gave them a final wipe. With the calipers all clean, I then started the very long process of sanding them down. Now I did only go this in depth with one of the calipers, as it was what felt like hours and hours of sanding, and sanding, even more sanding, a little bit more sanding, then finally, oh no, more sanding. until finally I had completed one caliper. I gave it a final clean and wipe down with an IPA, then it's time to mask them up before paint. I blocked the bleed nipple hole and the brake line hole with some masking tape, and then filled the piston housing with some paper and sealed it with some more masking tape. Same again on the rears, making sure I cover up the piston housing fully, as you really don't want any paint to get inside. So with the calipers all ready and prepped for paint, this is the setup I've got, obviously just on the garage door. I was planning on doing it outside, but the weather is horrendous outside today, so I've got the car covered up there, I've got the wheels covered up, I've also got a little fan going just to blow all the mist outside. Obviously it's not the best setup, you would like somewhere more ventilated, but this is just what I've got, so I'll get spraying now and then we can get them back on the car. So using my very high-tech jumper mask, which I don't recommend, I got to spray in the calipers, starting with 2 coats of white primer. On the fronts I didn't bother spraying the insides, as you won't see it. Then I sprayed 3 coats of red. I'll put the links to all the products I used in the description below. In between waiting for each coat to dry on the calipers, I decided to tackle the rusty dust shields on the rear. I removed all the loose rust first with a wire wheel, then sprayed them with 3 coats of black and 2 coats of high temperature clear. Back to the calipers then, and to finish them off I sprayed them with 2 coats of high temperature clear. I did get a weird reaction in some places, which may have been the drying times I left between coats or using different brands of paint, but they turned out good enough for me. So that is all the calipers and all the brackets sprayed up. As you can see there, I have rebuilt one of each, and I'm just going to show you rebuilding these 2 now. The finish isn't the best. I didn't actually end up sanding down the front calipers. I just scuffed them up with a bit of sandpaper and they've came up okay. I wish probably now I'd have got the paint on one. I think that would have been a lot easier. These have been curing for a week now. They should be okay, but the finish is a little bit iffy. Start rebuilding the last 2 now. This is the kit that I got. It's the big red kit. Comes with absolutely everything. And I've also got new caliper bolts here for the front and rear because mine were pretty dead. I'll get rebuilding these 2 now and then we can get them on the car. So the first thing to do after the respray is make sure all the surfaces are clean and free of overspray. I just use a bit of sandpaper to clean off any paint that had got onto the mating surfaces of the seals. Once it's all clean, it's then time to get the new piston in. You do have to swap over the handbrake mechanism from the old ones by popping out the spring and simply pulling it out. It can then be re-greased and put into the new one. The spring is very difficult to put back in, but I did see this neat little trick on another video. Use a flathead screwdriver to push the spring in, going in a spiral movement, and push each coil in one at a time until the very last coil at the top slots in. With the mechanism in, the new seal can be put on the piston using some new brake fluid, and the inner seal can go inside the caliper, making sure it sits flush. The piston can then be wound in, starting it off by hand, then using a rewind tool. Once the piston's in about halfway, I made sure the seal was seated on the caliper properly, just using a flathead screwdriver. Then the new bleed nipple can be fitted. I use some sandpaper just to take the paint off around the edge, just to make sure it doesn't seize. With that fitted, the next things to go in are the slider pin seals, again using a dab of brake fluid to help them slide in. carefully used a flathead screwdriver just to make sure they're seated properly. The handbrake spring is next to go on, and that just simply hooks on. Moving on to the fronts then, and it's a very similar process. Once all the overspray has been removed from the piston housing, the first seal can go in. Then the main seal can be put onto the piston and a dab of brake fluid used to help slide it into the caliper. With the piston all the way in, I made sure the seal was seated correctly. Then just like the rears, the slider pin seals can be pushed in. I highly recommend the Big Red kit as it came with absolutely everything and the quality was bang on. The last thing to go on is the bleed nipple, and that's the calipers rebuilt. Now that the calipers are all rebuilt, it's then time to get the brake pads in. So I went with EBC red stuff. They're an upgrade over the OEMs, but they're not too aggressive, and they also have reduced brake dust, which is good for me. So this one with the big spring gets pushed into the piston in the caliper, and then the other one can go into that side. Then we can finally get the calipers on the car. Like I said then, the pad with the smaller black spring clips into the outer side of the caliper, and the larger silver spring pad goes into the piston. With all 4 calipers rebuilt, it's finally time to get them back on the car. Starting with the rears, I cleaned up the hubs and applied a thin layer of grease to make sure the new disc doesn't seize onto them. The new genuine Ford disc can go on and the protective layer cleaned off. As this is the rear, I fitted the spacer back on just to hold the disc in place. The carrier can then be bolted on using the new OEM bolts. I applied a small layer of grease to the carrier before the new pads went on. Make sure the pad with the spring on top goes on the back of the disc. I fitted the new hell braided line while the caliper was off the car, as you don't have much room to get a spanner in once it's on. I cleaned up the slider pins and applied a good amount of grease before sliding them in. Get it? Oh, never mind. They can be tightened down, and then the braided line can be connected to the hard line. Once it's tight, the retaining clip can be hammered back on and the rubber grommet hooked into the bracket. The handbrake cable is then slotted into the caliper, and the end of the cable can then be hooked onto the caliper. And finally, to finish up the rears, the caliper spring can be refitted. The front calipers can then go on next, and again, it's pretty much the same process, just a little simpler than the rears. Once the hub's cleaned and greased up, the new disc can go on, and I just used a lug nut to hold it in place. I used new bolts for the carrier, the same as the rears, and then before the caliper goes on, I fitted the new braided line. As I've already fitted the pads to the calipers, they can both be fitted together. The nicely cleaned up slider pins can go in next and be tightened up. Then the hell braided line gets connected to the hard line, tightened up, and the retaining clip knocked in. And finally, just like the rears, the caliper spring gets refitted, and that's job done. And there we have it then. All 4 calipers are now back on with new discs and pads. Same on the rear. I have already taken the cowling off and the wipers off, ready to get the brake fluid put in. I will be upgrading the brake fluid as well, so we've gone with Motul RBF 600. I've run this in a few cars. Again, this isn't a track car, it's mostly going to be for street, but every little helps, and it is going to give a better pedal feel. So I'll get this refilled in. I'm going to get my dad to help me bleed the brakes, and then we can go for a drive. I used a vacuum bleeder first just to get as much air out as possible, then I asked my dad to pump the pedal. Press. Press. Are you pressing? Useless. So after getting someone who's not completely useless to pump the pedal for me, I started the passenger side rear, then the driver's side rear, making sure I keep the reservoir topped up, then moving on to the front, starting with the passenger side, and finishing up on the driver's side. The wheels can then go back on. And before the car gets lowered back down, I refitted the windscreen scuttle panel and the wipers. Then the car's ready to come down for the last time. So that is finally the caliper rebuild done. I think it looks way better. Although the paint job on the calipers didn't come out so great, just the brightness of the red and the new discs look way better. I'm glad I did it. In all fairness, it was mostly just for the rebuild of the calipers and new disc and pads. Spraying them was just while they were off. Again, if I was to do it again, I'd probably do the brush on one. But there we have it. Thank you very much for watching. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.